I think that it was widely believed because of the huge population advantage and because of a sense that surely those people living north of the border hated the British as much as we did. We might even be welcomed
Liberators.
as
Yeah.
liberators.
Yeah.
And of course, that was not the case at all. But I think that was a widely held view.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stories of 1812 podcast. This is a series in which we look at the lives of individual people who lived during the War of 1812. We talk to scholars, writers, researchers, public officials, people who are familiar with the lives of these individuals. And today we have a very special guest, fresh from the cornfields of Nebraska. I'm not sure if the corn is fresh, but Don, welcome, Don Hickey. And Don is an award-winning author and historian. You've been a historian for over 40 years, I believe, right? And you've written 12 books, many of them on the War of 1812, including the highly acclaimed The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict, which has been, I think, reissued, republished with the bicentennial of the war. You received the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award from the USS Constitution Museum. You've done extensive consulting in this area for historical parks, museums, and government agencies. Don, welcome. Welcome to this part of the world.
Well, thank you. All the way from the wilds of Nebraska.
The wilds. Why do I say cornfields?
Well, that's okay too.
You know the one thing I remember about Nebraska, if we just start out with a little light story, are the corn huskers. Why do we know about the corn huskers here?
Five national championships in
Ah,
the 1970, I guess 70s and 90s.
yeah. But are they now? You're at Wayne State College, I think, up there, right? But is that the Wayne State College team, or the Lincoln, Nebraska?
It's the University of Nebraska
Okay,
team. I was
okay,
at a state college, Wayne State College,
yeah,
retired 3 years ago, but still pretty active professionally.
including cheering for the Cornhuskers.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Well, today we're going to consider a very, how would you say it, a very gigantic question, and that is who won the War of 1812? Now, that's a bit of a misleader because I think eventually what we'll do is just talk about the outcome. But let's start with a quote from a very famous Canadian historian named Charles P. Stacey. And he wrote about the War of 1812 in 1958 in a paper. And he said, the War of 1812 is one of those episodes in history that makes everyone happy because everybody interprets it in his own way. Now, we both acknowledge that, but we know a guy who is just, I think, on the other side. He's a Western New York historian who's put it more succinctly, hasn't he? His name is Dick. Uh, is it Dick DeGraff?
Uh, Doug DeCroix.
Boy, if I get that wrong. Doug DeCroix. And what did Doug say?
Well, I'd say it was 25 years ago, and
Yeah,
I knew Stacy, but I hadn't read that article.
yeah,
And Doug gave me what I thought was, with due acknowledgement of Stacy's commentary, gave me a really pithy take on that. He said, everybody's happy with the outcome of the war. Americans are happy because they think they won. Canadians are happier because they know they won. And the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten all about the war. And I think, except for the Indians, who were the big losers, that's not a bad assessment.
Mhm. Can we walk through each one of those, those parties and sort of break it down a little bit? Because the thing that we hear about the U.S. is often that it was its second war of independence, and it truly it developed its national army. It became a player internationally. Would you say it was that, or was it more?
Well, I was never happy with that phrase,
Mm,
Second War of Independence, because the British really didn't threaten American independence.
mm,
Now, in kind of a broad sense, they threatened American sovereignty because of the encroachments on our neutral rights on the high seas. But those were limited to the Napoleonic Wars. And whenever those wars ended, the encroachments on our rights would end. So I really thought that was an overstatement. The British weren't trying to recolonize the United States. They weren't even trying to take territory that they could hold permanently. So I think that's something of a misnomer. The way I look at it, who won the war, it depends on what you focus on. If you look on the battlefield or the peace treaty, it looks like a draw.
mhm,
The Treaty of Ghent provided for returning to the status quo ante bellum. Any conquered territory would be given up. If you look at war aims, it's a clear British and Canadian victory. The British preserved their maritime rights. They weren't even mentioned in the peace treaty. Canada remained a British possession. It is really Canada's war of
mm,
independence, and they won. And that
mhm.
paved the way for independence, the Dominion, and all that followed.
But could you not argue, just to be devil's advocate, that, the U.S. faced a native insurgency, and as a result of the war, there was no more native well, there probably was, but they weren't given that buffer state that they, wanted and that the British had promised them, and the U.S. gained that in the Treaty of Ghent. They didn't have to, give up land for a native buffer state.
Well, that's true, but that would have never been given up or
Mm,
never been an issue with the British had not the United States declared war on Great Britain in June of 1812. No
mm,
War of 1812, no talk of a buffer state on the
mm,
part of Great Britain.
mm,
So I don't think that was an issue. The one way you can kind of say the United States profited from the war, besides forging an American identity with all the sayings and symbols, the USS Constitution, which had four successful cruises, the American flag, which gains a new respect, and we have the Fort McHenry flag
yeah,
at the
and your
Smithsonian.
national anthem, yeah.
You've got the national anthem. You've got "Don't Give Up the Ship." We've
Mhm,
met the enemy, and they are ours, which are Perry's contribution. So you've kind of forged an identity of what it meant to be an American. But there's one very important sort of development. The British have a real problem after the war, and that is how do they defend Canada
Canada,
in
yeah,
the next war
yeah,
with this aggressive expansionist nation to the south? And study after study showed they'd have to spend millions of pounds fortifying Canada and maintaining troops there. And the British concluded the best way to protect Canada was to accommodate the United States.
yeah,
And that's essentially what they did throughout the
in the
19th
various
century.
boundary disputes as well that we had
There
with
were
them, yeah,
three treaties that settled
yeah,
the Canadian-American boundary. There was Treaty of Washington, which
mhm,
resolved other issues. Some of the issues just faded away. The impressment issue, because the British by the 1850s were able to recruit enough seamen to man their warships. They didn't have to go
well,
after
they'd
American
finished the
merchant
war with
vessels.
Napoleon, yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
if they'd had another war
mm,
after 1850, as they ultimately did, they didn't have to look beyond their borders for seamen.
mm,
And this in turn ultimately led to an Anglo-American Accord in the 1890s. That turned into co-belligerency in World War I
yeah.
and a full-fledged alliance in World War II. So the Americans got what they wanted, a greater respect for their sovereignty, and the British got what they wanted because they managed to deflect American aggression,
Mhm.
expansionism, west and south, and Canada remained in British hands.
One minor gain that I'm thinking of as you're talking is what about the building of a professional army? Because after the War of Independence, the veterans, the Dearborns, the Halls, they retired, they faded, but then you had the Winfield Scotts and the William Henry Harrisons. They came up through the ranks. You really had a good army after the War of 1812.
We did.
Yeah.
The way I would put it is the War of 1812 produced a dual commitment to maintaining a peacetime military establishment, which the Jeffersonian Republicans had been against, but now embraced in the
Mm,
wake of the difficulties in the War of 1812. And you now had a more professional army.
mm,
West Point was feeding the regular army, the professional army, the American army with a steady stream of officers. The Navy already was kind of professional because the U.S. has such a rich maritime tradition, and that
Not
continued.
at the beginning of the war.
Yes,
Yeah, the British had 500 ships and the US had maybe 16,
that's
right?
exactly it. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, the American Navy was very well stocked with capable officers and seamen,
Mm,
and thus they prevailed in the first five single ships engagements with the British. Now, that was also a result of often superior ships. The heavy frigates of the United States
mm,
clearly outmatched the lighter frigates of Great Britain. But in any case, you had just, I think, a more professional Army and Navy, and that was another byproduct of the War of 1812.
mhm.
One could argue that the American military establishment was born during the War of
Okay, maybe
1812.
that's a good way to put it. So, if we go to Canada, and you've already alluded to the fact, this was, kind of Canada's victory. Can we sort of take it point by point? Because, the big thing for us, I mean, I say us as the Canadian, we're a funny people, because Brock gets killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights, and we think he won the Battle of Queenston Heights. But we had victory by not being annexed. I know that's a topic today, in the public press, but that was important to us. We defended our homes. We kept the enemy out. We had an alliance between the Indigenous, between the militia, and the British regulars. And many of those settlers who formed the militia were American immigrants, you know? And why didn't they, kind of a curious thing, why didn't they pick up, rifles or muskets at the time and fight with the Americans?
Well, most of them, I think, wanted to sit out the war, except
Mm,
for the United Empire Loyalists, those Americans who had migrated to Canada after the Revolution because they wanted to remain British subjects rather than become American citizens.
mhm.
But I would say it was largely the British Army and Indian allies with some support from the Canadian militia. But both nations, the United States and Canada, sort of pumped up the role that militia had played in this war. And there was what I would call the militia myth that the
Yeah.
militia had either won or prosecuted the war for the two nations. And I would give major credit to British regulars and their Indian allies. But
Mm.
nevertheless, it turned out to be a successful war of independence for Canada. And later on, Canadians look back and they sort of figured that out. And I think it was really after the Confederation was established in 1860.
1867, yeah.
And they look
Yeah.
back and they say, that Brock and some of the other characters who served in the war, they were real heroes. I think they ought to add John Norton,
Yeah.
the great leader of the Grand River Iroquois, and they ought to add
Mm.
Sir George Prevost, the Governor General, who took a lot of heat because he retreated from New York in the last campaign there, but he did a great job of marshaling their limited resources to wage a defensive
Well, but
war.
history is 2020, history with hindsight, we always, can say, well, he carried it out. I mean, at the time, there are letters between him and Brock where you can tell Brock is gritting his teeth and, he's trying to remain polite in that army speak that he has to follow. But Prevost wouldn't give him any men. I think he did actually give him some, to be correct. But here he had, 1,200 regulars to defend, the St. Lawrence all the way down through the Niagara Peninsula, all the way across Lake Ontario. And so Brock used his little tricks and
Mhm.
alliances with, fur traders to get done what he wanted to get done, namely bringing the Indigenous into the onto the side of his army.
Well, he did a great job
Yeah.
of managing the campaigns further west. But keep in mind, this
Mm,
war was never going to be won by either side in the West.
mm,
The critical points of contact were going to be Montreal and Quebec. The British, these two cities anchored British defenses on the St. Lawrence. And if the United States couldn't conquer them, they weren't going to conquer Britain. And if the British could hold on to Montreal and Quebec, they were going to win this war. And most of Brock's actions were further west.
mhm. Well, I mean, Quebec, indeed. I mean, to anyone who's been there, you're not going to conquer that place. Montreal, maybe there was an attempt by, now I'm going to get the name wrong,
Yeah.
Wilkinson and Wade Hampton, a two-pronged attack, but that fizzled. That
Yes.
didn't go anywhere. So,
No,
yeah.
the two egregious fools seeking to pull off the conquest of at least that part of Canada. They were part of the relics who, before Madison had discovered the really good officers, these guys were still in charge. And they both were forced into retirement as a result of that failed campaign. And thereafter, you had much more effective leadership in Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott.
Mhm, mhm. Let's go to the British for a second. I know we're going to come back to Canada. We're going to go, back and forth, but let's consider the British for a moment. The British did not have to relinquish their belligerent rights. Impressment wasn't mentioned in the treaty. They didn't want they didn't have to give in to the demands of a buffer state. We'll come back to that in a moment about the Indigenous. But I think mostly they were war weary. I mean, they've been fighting Napoleon for whatever,
20
15,
years
15, 20 years. They had had enough, they,
they had. And
yeah,
that worked to the advantage of the United States because the
yeah,
British were clearly in the driver's seat in the last year of the war. They had been released from the Napoleonic Wars. They could beef up their forces in the New World against the United
send
States.
veterans over here.
The
Yeah,
United States, by contrast, had all kinds of problems, which I enumerated in a chapter called The Crisis of 1814 in the book that's subtitled The Forgotten Conflict.
conflict.
The British were in the driver's seat. As one contemporary said, a contemporary put it, the war, how did he put it? It was uh, the war for free trade and sailors' rights had become a war to defend the nation. I mean, the whole character of the war changed.
Mm.
And the United States was lucky to escape without making any major concessions. And the British, in the end, didn't insist on any because their campaign in 1814 didn't come out very well. It's just too difficult to wage offensive war in the North American continent. Don Graves has a lot to say about
Yeah,
that. I learned
yeah,
a lot from him about that. And so the British were just war weary. They didn't want another year of war, another year of war taxes. And one of the British Tories said, it's not just the opposition who's complaining, our own followers are complaining. So they finally agreed to that treaty that simply returned to the status quo ante bellum.
yeah. Now, the party that unfortunately lost were the Indigenous tribes now, or Indigenous nations. Now, they're different. So if we're going to talk about them, we would have to talk about them, you know, in groups or break down the title of Indigenous nations. Um, I think, and you would have to venture an opinion here, I think the Six Nations still had their grievances, but they still had their lands and they still had a lot of the land tract that was given to them by the British after the Revolutionary War. There's still disputes about it, but they were still
Mhm.
here and they were still, Norton being one of their leaders, able to defend their lands. But the natives in the South, the Red Sticks, for example, were not. And the Shawnee Confederacy, under Tecumseh, that fizzled after he died. Where did it leave them? Did they all move west of the
Well,
Mississippi?
the end of the War of 1812 left the Indians in the Old North and in the Old Southwest at the mercy of the United States.
Mm,
Essentially, the native tribes had lost the Tecumseh's War, they'd lost the Creek War in the South, and because the British abandoned them as allies, decided they just didn't couldn't manage them. The Indian way of war was so different; they weren't going to rely on them if there were another war with the United States. And so the Indians were left at the mercy of the United States. and they, in the end, surrendered most of their lands. Now, if you look at what happened in Canada,
Mm,
you had a much more benevolent government, but the process was not entirely different. The Indians lost a lot of their lands north of the border too, even though you had a much less aggressive central government and one which was much more sympathetic to their needs.
mhm, mhm,
So in the end, their fate was better north of the border,
mhm,
but you had the same sort of trends that were at work. A declining population,
mhm,
land-hungry white
mhm,
settlers, and
mhm.
so you ended up with a similar process.
I mean, I think the only thing Canada has is, we just have a lot of land. We just go north, like
Yeah,
the Russians, you know, when Napoleon and Hitler invaded Moscow, they just moved east. I'm not saying it's entirely comparable, but there's a lot of land here, and I don't think there was the pressure that there was maybe in the Ohio Valley and other places. So,
that's absolutely correct.
yeah,
Canada is a huge country.
yeah.
The vast majority of the population lives within about 50 miles of the a border with the United States, and you've got all those lands to the north of that.
Mhm.
And you're right; they were didn't come under the same pressure that these lands in the United States did.
Um, stay with Canada for a moment, and we're bouncing back and forth. Canada, U.S., Britain, whatever. Um, this war was important to the Canadians, I think, and it shows up in opinion polls. I mean, we remember it here. We remember it as what, the third most important event in our history.
Well, a public opinion survey in 2000, I wish
Mm,
they'd do it again, but
mm,
showed that after the establishment of the Confederation in 1867 and the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885, which bound the two Canadas together, East and West, the War of 1812 was considered the third most important event in Canadian history, according to Canadians. And I think they're right,
mm,
because it really was their war of independence.
mm.
Now, if you took a similar poll in the United States, you'd be lucky to have the War of 1812 in the top 25. And if you did a poll like that in Britain, it might not
I
even
didn't
make the
remember.
list.
Yeah.
So I wish they'd redo the poll and do it in all three nations to see where this war stands.
Well, the irony for me, and we've alluded to this in our other conversations, is there were lots of American immigrants here. I mean, land was cheap, and it wasn't only the UELs, the United Import Loyalists, because they left because of their loyalty to the crown after the Revolutionary War. But a lot of Americans immigrated here. Land was cheap, taxes were lower, if non-existent, and yet they didn't pick up their muskets and fight alongside the Americans. I mean, they must have been converted,
I would take issue with that and say
Yeah,
rather than being converted, they just didn't want to fight this war.
yeah.
But they weren't eager to join the British forces either. So I would say the core resistance of the Canadian citizens was the or subjects, I should say, because of the crown. They're those United Empire loyalists.
Mm,
It's not the recent American immigrants. Now, it is true they didn't join the American invading forces, but they just didn't want to fight this war. A lot of the Canadian native-born Canadians didn't either. Who might be part of the militia. A lot of them defected when Hull marched his force up into Fort Detroit in 1812. They just
yeah,
went home,
yeah.
and Brock was very unhappy with that development.
Well, again, the militia myth. I mean, citizens and settlers did fight. There were three York militias, and Brock was very proud of them. But some of them had the same concerns, I think, as the natives. We got crops coming in, or we've got to
Yeah,
plant, to have a harvest so that we can eat.
yeah.
Yeah.
After the first Fort Meigs campaign in the
Mhm.
summer of 1813, I think the Indians gathered their booty and went home first. And then the militia said, "We got to get our crops in." It was late May,
Mm.
and they started going home. And finally, Proctor said, "Well, we've got to give up this campaign," and Fort Meigs remained in American hands.
Yeah. Yeah. If we could, can we move a little bit to the prosecution of the war, the execution of the war? Um, and we've alluded to it. Um, and I think in previous conversations you've said this. And again, I'm posing questions that a layman might pose, and that is why would the U.S. go to war? There's sections of this. These are questions that have been floating around in my head. Why would the U.S. go to war if they were unprepared to go to war? And if I could add, and I know you're an expert on this, you know, there was division within the country.
Mhm.
I mean, there was the South, there was the Northeast, right? How did the war hawks, how did Henry Clay carry the day? I mean, could not Madison, presidents always deal with factions. Was Madison pro war? Did he cave? Did the war hawks have too much of an influence? And the unpreparedness must have been known to them.
Well, to understand this, Madison was in favor of war. The restrictive system imposing economic sanctions on Great Britain had not worked. And there would have been no war without his approval. But he
Mhm,
recommended in his address in December, his opening address to Congress, that Congress put the nation in an armor and an attitude demanded by the crisis, which meant war preparations.
mhm,
And then on June 1st, he sent a war message to Congress. Had that war message never been sent, I don't think the United States would have gone to war.
mhm.
So he was fully on board. Now, Madison and a number of Republican leaders hoped that no fighting would be necessary, that there was a sense that the British weren't taking us seriously. And if we declared war, they would be shocked into their senses and they would make concessions on these vital maritime
How
issues.
much is Jefferson's quote, which is remembered so well in this country, a mere matter of marching? Was that a prevalent attitude, do you think?
Absolutely. It was
Yeah,
widely believed the
yeah.
United States had a 15-1 population
Relation
advantage.
advantage. Yeah.
They knew there were a lot of recent American immigrants whose loyalty to Canada or the British was unlikely to be very solid. And so it was widely believed that there wouldn't be much
Mhm.
resistance. Jefferson said we would conquer everything up to Montreal in the first year, be a mere matter of marching,
Marching.
and the rest of Canada would fall the following year. And Henry Clay said the militia of Kentucky alone, who were really pretty good fighters, could take
That's right.
Canada.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I think that it was widely believed because of the huge population advantage and because of a sense that surely those people living north of the border hated the British as much as we did. We might even be welcomed
Liberators.
as
Yeah.
liberators.
Yeah.
And of course, that was not the case at all. But I think that was a widely held view.
But and again, when and I've not read everything, but the things that I've read are, the Canadian successes were remarkable. You know, now we didn't succeed at all battles like Chippewa, but Queenston Heights, Stony Creek, which was in the middle of the night, they
Mhm.
were outnumbered 3-1. I mean, is there one overall conclusion that we could draw? Was it different in different geographical areas? Was it the inability of leadership? Because, if you talk to Graves, he'll talk a lot about the junior officers, both British and American. A lot of those were pretty good, and capable soldiers. What's the military thing that I'm missing?
Well,
You know?
the professional British Army was really good.
Mm,
Good leadership, battle hardened.
yeah.
These guys knew how to fight battles, and they had excellent leadership.
Mm,
The United States had a lot of soldiers who were not very well trained, had never seen the heat of battle,
mm,
and the senior leadership was appalling. And it took a couple of years for those people in the middle level, like Scott and Brown,
yeah.
to kind of
Work
assert
their way up.
themselves.
Yeah.
And you had others like Jackson and Harrison who also ultimately emerged as theater commanders, and they were very good leaders. So a matter of both the experience and the training of the armies, the British was far better, and the leadership at the beginning of the war, the British was far better.
Well, a little footnote to that. I'm not sure that Phineas Real properly sized up Winfield Scott at Chippewa, because I think that was a surprise, is how good Scott had drilled his men and trained his men. And, there was a professional soldier, and I don't have a quote, but that the Redcoats could respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But bear in mind that's 1814.
Yeah.
That's 2 years into the war, and by then the United States had developed a pretty effective army. But by then the British had built up their own forces in North America,
Yeah.
and so the two armies were probably comparable.
What about the planning? I mean, all of this as we talk, it's kind of, where's the logic? It's like emotion rather than logic, because the plan wasn't that great, was it? Most of the
No.
resources, three-pronged attack, a lot of the resources dedicated to the West. I remember reading about Winchester's long slog, or Hull's long slog to Detroit, and they had to build roads as they went and block houses. I mean, you can't fight a war in the wilderness. Your supply lines are too long.
Well, that you certainly can't, and that's
Yeah.
a problem. The United States had no war planning agency.
Mm,
The War Department, sort of on the fly, before the Declaration, developed this plan for a three-pronged invasion of Canada, but they didn't have the forces who could carry it out. The logistics was pretty bad, tough to support offensive operations with the right logistics in the North American wilderness, and you had very poor leadership that first year or two of the war.
mhm,
So, no surprise that the
mm.
United States did so poorly early in the war.
How much would this war have happened anyway? Because it was really a sideshow, to the larger conflict in Europe. We're talking Battle of Waterloo, 30,000 dead in one day. I mean, the numbers here are just not up to the scale of what happened in Europe. Britain and France had a European rivalry. It was inevitable that there was going to be a clash. Uh, and the French, although you will know the answer to this better, but the French supported the Americans in the Revolutionary War. It escapes me how active they were in the War of 1812. I guess what I'm getting at is, there's a larger theater in any war. There's proxy fights. Did that have anything to do with this?
Well, that was the big war,
Mm,
the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, each side, France and Great Britain, were really waging what they thought might be a life and death struggle, and a struggle who was going to dominate Europe and
mm,
the wider world. And the British prevailed. But the American War was just a sideshow. The Americans might have thought, well, we'll take advantage of the British being tied up in Europe. The British, for their part, thought they'd been stabbed into a back in the back by another nation, and they figured they were fighting the war to uphold Western civilization.
mm,
So very unhappy with this. But it was all a sideshow
mm.
until Napoleon was defeated and sent into exile in April of
And
1814,
then he came back. Yeah.
and then later came back. By
Yeah.
then, the War of 1812 was over, though.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at your quote. You say the War of 1812 was a byproduct of the Napoleonic Wars, 1803, 1815, which was the final phase of a long period of Anglo-French warfare. That's where that
Yeah,
came from.
yeah.
If you remember writing that.
I do, and I
Yeah,
still make that point.
yeah,
But keep in mind, nobody knew that 1815 would mark the end of this Second Hundred Years' War that had begun in 1689 between England and France.
yeah.
Who knows? There might have been another war, and that's why you can't say, well, the British gave up the Orders in Council in 1812, and they didn't need to impress after 1815, so the maritime issues were moot. Well, not exactly,
Mm,
because there would be nothing to stop the British if there were another Anglo American war from resuming, or another Anglo French war, or a British war with anybody on the continent,
yeah.
from resuming those practices that had produced the War of 1812. And in fact, during World War I, during America's neutral period from 1914 to 1917, one of these issues, definition of contraband, reared
Mm,
its ugly head
mm,
again. And a guy who wrote a book on the neutral period had a chapter entitled The Shadow of 1812 because it
mm.
was one of the key issues in World War I.
So we're back to our friend Charles P. Stacey, or Dick DeGraff's variation.
Doug
Yeah, I can't.
DeCroix.
I'm gonna mess that up
That's okay.
forever. I'm gonna mess it up forever. Doug
Doug DeCroix.
DeCroix, and were they right? Have we come full circle? I mean, it's a nifty way of remembering it.
Well, in the end, things worked out pretty well. And
Yeah.
I've got to give the British the credit here
Mm.
because they pursued that policy of accommodation.
Mm.
And so that all three of the English speaking nations, aside from recent hiccups of
Yes.
recent times,
Yeah.
they have have had a very
We
good
all pulled
relationship.
together in NATO. We all pulled together in the post-World War II era.
Yeah,
So you're right. It probably was advantageous.
yeah. So give the
As a
British
result.
credit.
Yeah.
For that, and let's give the Canadians credit for helping us remember the War of 1812.
Mhm.
They understand it was their war of independence and that it deserves a high profile in the Canadian memory, and it helps the rest of us who prefer to forget it in America or Great Britain to maybe think more about this war and
Yeah.
the profound and lasting legacy it left on the English speaking community
Mm.
in the Atlantic world.
More than it being about an individual country, it's more about the English-speaking nations.
Agreed.
Yeah. That's a wonderful note to end up on. And I want to thank you for coming up all the way from the cornfields. Give our greetings to the corn huskers. They're remembered here in obscure Canada. And we thank you for being here, Don, today. And thank you for joining us, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this. I'm learning all the time as I have these wonderful guests come on. Our series website is thestoriesof1812.com. And I want to thank Jim Valen of Valen Entertainment for doing the wonderful technical work. And we will see you all next time. Thank you for joining us.